Good afternoon, everyone. My talk today is a continuation of the presentation I gave at the last CANS conference in Auckland, from memory 2 years ago. It's really a short, lyrical, zigzagging essay on shifting states. Like last time, it begins with a walking theme. The walking theme actually pervades it. You know the ground has shifted when you arrive in Christchurch, and great chunks of the city seem to have disappeared, with few visual clues or landmarks. This loss of bearing and shift of perception forces one to be resourceful, however, and find new ways of navigating. When you arrive in your hotel room and find the one small rectangular block of soap is called Superfood Skincare, Skin Detox Body Bar with 1% parsley stem, you know your conception of soap has shifted. And I won't start on the placards they hang on the door to say do not disturb or please disturb. So clever and ironic are they that I couldn't understand them. On my street in Auckland, the tree roots have bulged under the pavement over the decades. And so walking up or down, I lurch and dip to maintain balance. The unexpectedness of this lumpy terrain forces me to adapt to its unpredictable state. And there's a picture of, actually not my street, but a typical sort of Aucklandy pavement in which this occurs. It's a common thing for any of us to see. Scientific studies show us that the benefits from walking on uneven surfaces are overwhelming. Improvements in equilibrium, spatial orientation, memory, focus, reaction time, and overall cognitive fitness, as our brains are required to make billions of calculations per millisecond. This manifestation of shifting ground is therefore a given for any of us who value our brain and its capacity for memory. Surely this is all of us. The ground underneath us is never stable. In fact, the common ground we often strive for within our societies is likewise ever malleable and, in some cases, slipping away. This is not a bad thing, as I think I've described with the roots under the pavement. The state of flux is the only thing. As I perambulate my city, Auckland, I'm aware of the physical, sociological, cultural, economic, geographical, and architectural, to name just some, in continual shift and flux. We place enormous value on standing on secure ground. Evolution has seen us develop to be erect hominids, if that's the right term. Michael Norris is nodding, so it must be. Feet planted solidly, dependably on the earth. Actually, for most of my life, I wondered about the expression feet of clay. And I confess that most of my early decades, I thought this meant strength and rootedness in the very foundation of the land. I won't test you on whether any of you others thought that. Did any of you others think that feet of clay meant something strong and stable? Okay. I was disabused of this notion when I found it meant the opposite, a very human flaw in someone's personality. However, a little later I came to see that this quality is very often the feature that marks someone as distinctive and memorable and therefore appealing. Which of us present at the CANS conference Sonic Broom in 2001 could forget the aforementioned and late Ted Carr, booming his distaste at some excrescence of 20th century music or another? He clearly represented, obviously, someone with feet of clay. And ironically to me, damn it, where is Ted now that we need him to keep nudging from an alternative view, perhaps even to shift us out of our seeming smugness about things? As I walk, I think about things like this. as, for me, there's something about movement that throws up new possibilities of thought and new possibilities of creativity, otherwise denied to my seated, supposedly working state. A few years ago, my father and I were walking in Dunedin and passed one of those old-fashioned barber's poles that you don't see very much anymore, attached to the barbers, that used to turn helter-skelter in an ever-ascending or descending motion. Red for arterial blood, blue for venous blood, white for bandage, Dad declared in stentorian tone. You know, barbers and surgeons used to be very close. At the Royal College of Surgeons in London, there's a painting in the conference hall by Holbein of Henry VIII conferring the trust on the Guild of Barbers and Surgeons. Dad went on, well, think about it, in one of his favourite phrases. Who had the sharp blade to open the boil or abscess? Doctors didn't have blades. How fluid was the barber-surgeon merger? When did things shift from skilled cutthroat blade specialists to specifically highly trained brain surgeons and chin shavers on the other hand? Dad taught me many things on our decades of walks and talks together. When I was last going for an operation on my hand, on this hand in point of fact, which didn't work very well because you can see that my Dupuytren's finger has since retracted, but that's another story. He exhorted me to make friends with the anaesthetist, as he or she was key to the success of a smooth operation. Thus I had a good chat with, let's call him Richard, and urged him to go lightly on the anaesthetic. Apparently I woke after 4 hours or more, suddenly and clearly, immediately looking at the clock and exclaiming at the long time that I'd been under. So I've been thinking a lot about this merger from consciousness and in and out of it. The late New Zealand scientist Paul Callaghan, if you remember him talking on Radio New Zealand, very interestingly with Kim Hill, describes this transition in his Slim Bridget Williams book, Luminous Moments. Don't know if you know that little series. He talks about this being a complete absence from my life. It seemed but an instant, and I was emerging from a delicious unconscious inside a spacecraft with beautiful grey walls, a feeling of floating in fluid, of warmth and well-being. Rather like being in the womb, if any of us can remember back that far. But some people can remember back that far, apparently. I have been present as both my parents crossed or were about to cross the life-death boundary, this ultimate shift from one ground to the next. At the time of writing this, my father lies in the Otago Medical School as a donor cadaver for dissection by students undertaking anatomical study, as he would have done himself as a medical student there in the 1940s. For me, he has shifted from the safe ground of the living to being clinically dead, but still actively useful. Even when his ashes have been taken to the appointed place, they will nourish and support new growth and new life. This ground shifting I find strangely comforting, and it slightly surprises me that I'm able to talk about it in such a way, and I think that is the reason. All must shift, all must change, all must die. In his memorable book, Soundscapes, A Musician's Journey Through Life and Death, if you know that book, the Medici string quartet leader, the renowned violinist Paul Robertson, described his death experience in astonishing detail. After all, it is only those who have died and returned who can live to tell the tale, as it were. Jesus Christ is a famous example of a person who purportedly rose from the dead, but unfortunately we have no solid evidence of this fact. Whereas Robertson's case he describes in startlingly candid prose, and is particularly interesting as he had vivid, clear recollections of the hallucinogenic states within which he was suspended, going into the death state and coming out of it. There's a picture of the late Paul Robertson. I seem to be talking about dead males throughout this whole talk, I've just realised, but I guess that's salutary. So in his book, he says, as I lay there waiting, I felt myself die. Beautifully, ecstatically, transcendentally, I saw eternity and shed the whole of myself joyfully in order to become unified with it. Some of you may remember the recent death of Jack Boddy, where, from my point of view, he seemed to have a beautiful death. At least I remember announcing it as such at the Karl-Heinz Company concert, which happened a couple of hours later in Auckland. During this time, says Robertson, I lost all sense of self, including the inner voice normally present within us that tells us who and what we are. That still small internal monitoring voice was to remain missing for many weeks. In its absence, there were still the sensations of experience, but no me to register them. And he goes on. Towards the end of this extended ecstatic period, I began to dare to hope and anticipate a final permanent state of union with the Divine One. This profound longing was accompanied by a kind of accelerated sense of rushing towards total immersion or heavenly union. Suddenly we were surrounded by beautiful laughing male angels, all dressed in white, clean-shaven, sporting virile swept-backed hair and smelling strongly of aftershave. Were the nurses at this point shaving me? What's interesting about this telling of this death experience is that Robertson could remember in such detail and then could equate it when he awoke with things that must have been happening like that. Nothing is more ambiguous than the limbo that lies between living and dying. That subtle edge is ephemeral and transient, yet always noumenal, neither happy nor sad, rational or intuitive, cognitive or instinctive, but a mixture of these seeming polarities. Seems to be a fairly good way to go about one's life, and in particular one's creative journey. Another link in Robertson's compelling book is his relationship with British composer the late John Tavener. Coincidentally, both men had a near-death experience and were keen to write about it and tell people about it, and were to eventually both die. That's not a coincidence, of course. Related to their conditions. Tavener was writing a piece called Towards Silence, of which I hitherto haven't been aware, but I'm glad I found out about. It's a piece for 4 string quartets and a Tibetan bowl. And of it he said, even though I regard myself as a vessel through which a vision passed, the construction of the work is rigorous in the layout of the string quartets, unseen by the audience, and the Tibetan bowl is very important. 4 string quartets surround the audience, and a Tibetan bowl sounds from a high point every 19 beats. Robertson's description here is apt. The spatial arrangement of the invisible surround sound quartets creates an experience akin to listening within the womb, or a baptism of total auditory immersion. The totality of the work transcended any individual virtuosity and built into something greater than the sum of its parts, etc. This all reminded me of my beloved New Zealand composer friend Gerard Crotty, who died of cancer at the age of 30, not before declaring that he could see the front gate. a deeply religious man, a Catholic brother, with whom I actually attended an Australia and New Zealand choreographers and composers conference here in the mid-80s. In fact, it was the last time I was in this art centre. I remember it very clearly. Crotty's faith was at odds with Robertson's avowed atheism, yet each described a state of letting go at the most crucial boundary shift of all. I wrote a cello piece in his memory, Commemoration, which some of you may know, which was my first experience of elegiac writing. It was revelatory for me in its easy transition from impetus to sound, and seemed to write itself quickly and easily. There was no wrestling with the competing desires of musical material and manifestation that I usually experience. Sitting in Nelson Cathedral a couple of years ago, I was moved to tears by the words in Jack Boddy's final work, and many of us were there, performed by the New Zealand String Quartet and the Sydney Song Company. The frail composer sat in the front row and himself listened to the words, "It's time to embrace the ocean," as the audience seemed to feel the journey palpably through surrogate experience. These are all examples of the ultimate ground being shifted and traversed. To me, they provide a deep consolation somehow, not literally a life after death, because I don't think I believe in that construct, but the knowledge that there could be clarity, revelation, and possibly ecstasy awaiting us. And here I'll leave out Zeno's paradox, which is no bad thing. To return to, briefly, my father, I want to recap my earlier observation of his state, knowing that humour is crucial within life and within death situations. At the time, gentlemen, please, of writing, my, how you've grown, father, lies, damn lies and statistics, in the Otago medical schools out for summer, as a donor could have a great day, awaiting dissection by blackbird students, undertake King Carl Gustaf of Sweden, anatomical study link bus, as he would have done himself, phone charger, as a medical misadventure student, there, now, in the 1940s are the best years of your life. I use Monty Python's word association football skit as a somewhat tenuous trope with which to create concatenations between seemingly disparate or binary states. And you'll see a very good example of these concatenations in Monty Python's word association football skit, which I think is one of the cleverest things that they did, which upon investigation or expansion turn out to be extremely slippery, to wit, that of sense and nonsense. Python understood the elision of the sensible and absurd, the poetic and the punny, like few others. Monty Python widened the gap between formal speech and research in a brilliantly polystylistic peroration. In the most grave of situations, we must not take ourselves too seriously. Thinking about the shift of ground from life to death and perhaps back again, I come back to Paul Robertson. The candle burns brightest just before it goes out. Thank you. I hasten to add that I was going to be talking about two pieces of mine, the current pieces that are in point of fact ekphratic, a word I just learnt today thanks to Diana Blom, but I didn't get round to it because I was being too discursive, and I didn't really mean either to go down the death route, but I found myself doing that. This is not an apology, just an explanation.